Thank you, Steve. It's kind of amazing for me because I actually heard that whole piece all the way to the end. And I wasn't actually sure at this point whether my father even knew the piece all the way to the end anymore. So really, thank you for kind of resolving the chord, you might say. So it's a helpful thing that way. I previously gave a eulogy for my father back in March at his memorial mass. And since then, I've sort of gotten to know him, you might say, over again. And so I have taken what I said before and kind of expanded on it because of getting to know him all over again from the people who knew him not as a father, but as someone else, you know, a man who was involved with what they were involved in. And so I want to kind of review, or a reprise, you might say, of what was said before, maybe from a little bit of a different viewpoint. So let me go ahead and speak to that. My father had died 2 weeks before when I gave his previous eulogy. There was something in rereading the words I wrote at that time that brought back the rawness of the moment. I've had nearly a year to reflect on who my father was and to get to know him again, this time through the eyes of others who knew him. I'm struck by the person I have come to know from another angle now. I want to take this opportunity to paint an enlarged picture of the man I knew as my father, a picture created from the reflections of passing time. Some understandings have been reinforced, some have been slightly altered, but my understanding of what he meant to many people has been greatly expanded. I hope here to both show something of that public perception and to open a door into the man for those who may have only had the opportunity to see the outside. He was a man of amazing talents and abilities. He was also, like most of us, a man of contradictions. He was a man who from his childhood never believed that he was good enough. That belief drove him and fed the contradictions. The qualities he had were not valued in his formative years. He did not believe himself to be particularly gifted, yet he exuded confidence and held opinions strongly. He could be secretive and open, all at the same time. He was an empiricist, the Edison, not the Einstein, but even the empiricist has theories. When it came to making something, he never feared a problem. He really did look at them just as challenges, yet there were guitars he was unwilling to build. By his own admission to me, sometimes he would tell someone he could do something before he was even sure how he could. Over time, though, his ability to make things had been tested and tried in industry. He had years as a machinist, tool maker, and tool engineer before he turned to guitar making. He was always learning, solving problems, staying alert, going his own way, proving himself. A driven competitor, the underlying insecurity was fuel. His competitive nature came out in many ways, and I personally was the main partner for one of those avenues: games. My dad loved games. I first knew my dad through playing games with him. Games were almost never for just the enjoyment of companionship or the fun of playing. They were for winning. Yet he was almost always a most gracious winner and rarely boasted. But if he lost, look out. Now he would shut the gates of mercy. Now he was angratized. Now he was going to really try. He did not play games with notions of mercy to the weak, of going easy on the learner until he had won. As a kid, one learned to accept months, or even years, of futility to be able to savor the glow of your own victory. His way of asking me if I wanted to play a game was, "Brah?" The cluck of a chicken, because you were too chicken to engage him. A biography of Michael Jordan that I read described Jordan playing games with his basketball teammates. He would never quit after he lost. He would only quit once he had won, and there almost always had to be a prize or a bet on the game. I knew I was seeing my dad. He was not content to rest upon his laurels. He was always ready to play one more. Michael Jordan meets guitar making. When I came to be my father's apprentice, he informed me that I would have 90 days to demonstrate that I could do work equal in quality to his own. I was set to the work of making parts for instruments. All the parts were checked and had to pass rigid quality standards. I was working to 1,000th of an inch. I was new to the work, but this is the big leagues. The learning curve was pretty steep. Catch on or move on, son or not, these were Gilbert guitars, and there would be no allowances made. If you're going to work with me, you're going to work like me, and you are going to think while you work. What could be done better? My dad was driven to improve. That was part of that spark of competition. His willingness to innovate was centered on getting a leg up, finding a better way. He had a little motivational card printed in 1950s aqua and black, very tasteful, tacked to the wall behind his workbench. "Work smarter, not harder," was the bold title, and under the several points about analyzing a job, it said, "You will find a better way." He taught me always to look for ways to improve, and it was a glowing triumph for me when I could find a way to improve on a process or procedure that he had developed. And those didn't come easily. For me to suggest an improvement was to indicate that he had not reached the pinnacle. He always dissected problems thoroughly, looking for pitfalls down the road in production, finding his way. He began an entire second business because he designed better tuning machines for the guitar. He was annoyed by the flaw he saw in other designs, and he made sure that his design was original. In fact, he received a patent. Another man who sought to improve the machines further examined my dad's and came to him and told him he couldn't see a better way. I think that was a high point for my dad. He respected many other guitar makers, but he had essentially contempt for the guitar maker who merely copied another's work. He would praise the one who came up with something new, even while looking to critique the new idea. He could and did look at other guitar makers' work early in his career, but he didn't directly copy. The goal was never to make an exact replica. He looked to improve upon it, to make it his own. He was willing to see how someone else did something, but only as a starting point for his own work. He made mistakes, but he didn't publicize them. Smart man, huh? I learned about them in the course of my time with him, and they were as important to learn about and to learn from as anything he had done. He was never striving to make a better copy. He was striving to improve his own work. To him, copying was akin to dishonesty. He wanted truth. And part of truth was doing it, the empiricist in him. He didn't want theories that weren't built around experience or testing, and the one who sat around dreaming up the perfect theoretical arrangement was not going to receive a warm reception. They received the special attention of being shown why their approach was unworkable in the real world, and they might even have been exhorted to get off their dead butt and build something. My dad had a passion for debunking, for finding out. That's how you win the game. He could not stand the mystique approach to anything. As far as he was concerned, that was cheating. He routinely would lampoon the claims of mystical guitar-making secrets, the wood cut on the north slope of the mountain at the full moon. There were guitars reputed to be made from a certain special piece of wood that a builder had obtained once. We used to joke about how if you gathered all those instruments together, that piece of wood would have had to have been the size of a car. To him, it was about reproducible results. As we so often discussed, dial indicators didn't have good and bad days. Data was everything. Test it, then you will know. Record it, and you can do it again, were his watchwords. His approach to guitar making was, skill and science will always prevail over ignorance and superstition. And that was one of his favorite phrases. He virtually always had a reason why a procedure was performed in a certain order, and that was therefore the right way. He wanted to be the one who had tested, who had found out. He seemed to have a penchant for hooking up with suppliers and asking big questions until they started asking him questions. Sometimes he ended up doing essentially original research. My dad relentlessly pursued precision, doing it right. If it was worth doing, it was worth doing it well. When he saw work that was cosmetically beautiful, yet with sloppiness, where it wasn't likely to be seen, his favorite phrase was, over ooey, unter fooey. You get the unter part, underneath. That isn't to say that he didn't think about careful placement of flaws in wood or doing work in a way that would hide real difficulties. To him, what you saw when you looked inside a guitar was one of the real indicators of craftsmanship. Just because people couldn't see it was no excuse. He didn't cut corners. He made guitars as though they would someday be dissected and every joint be laid bare. He could not help but make things level, square, flat, and plumb, even when they weren't critical. We used to joke about a wood post that he and I repaired in my mom and dad's home, that you could have used the splice piece for a gauge. It was probably the most accurately made piece of wood in the house. He used to extol the virtues of the contractor who built the house, 56 solid and stable years ago, but still complained that the contractor had put the roof beams of the house in wrong because they put the knots facing downward where they would be in tension and thus not as strong. There was no pity for the carpenter who would have had the hard job of spiking the roof planks to the beams with knots on the upper side, because that was the right way to do it. His early years made my dad a man who relished standing for the underdog. I think that was where he arrived at being a gracious winner. He was willing to acknowledge people who were unimportant. He traveled to Europe in the early 70s and met several of the great Spanish makers. A business card from Ignacio Fleta was tacked to the wall of the shop for years. It struck him to be received by one of such stature when he was unknown. He enjoyed helping people, but had his own approach. To the one who asked point blank how you did something, he could be evasive. To the one who had a problem he was trying to solve, he could offer incredible amounts of help. It came around to the replica maker versus the developer. He was not going to be a helper to the replica maker. He had the guitar-making version of give the man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. With rare exceptions, he did not reveal his own exact methods for building an instrument, but he would often set forth some of his philosophies of doing so. It was much like a parable. He who has an ear, let him hear. He wanted to make builders self-reliant, to build their own instruments. To that end, he was generous with his time. He was very concerned to hear what the player had to say. At the same time, he had his own ideas. My dad was willing to make known his thoughts on almost any subject. He rarely lacked an opinion. And he enjoyed freely sharing those opinions with people. Things which he had tested and tried bolstered his assurance. He was not a theoretician, except to determine what tests or experiments he ought to run. Later in his career, as he was established as a guitar maker, he became more willing to share his knowledge. His realization that he had something significant to contribute grew slowly. He was cordial with competitors and yet could be brutally honest. Posturing was not something he did well. What he thought was what he thought, no apologies. He wanted problems reduced to their simplest formulation. It seemed like nuances felt like evasions, which was ironic considering his attention to details. He and I used to have the most cordially loud discussions over his opinions and my disagreements with them. Usually, I couldn't accept the oversimplification. If I finally prevailed, it usually elicited the response, well, if you're going to resort to fact and proof. He was truly a complex man. On the one hand, confident almost to brashness. On the other, doubting his own abilities and being driven to prove them. He had a passion for truth. There was no way to make him angrier than to be found lying to him. If you told him you had lied, he could forgive and understand. If you tried to find it, if you tried to hide it, and he found out, well, you didn't want to be there. And to accuse him of such was to, in the words of Twain, covet destruction. He was once asked how to do a certain operation by another builder. He kindly showed that person how to do it. That person failed in their attempt and wrote him a letter indicating that If he really didn't want to show him how to do this, he shouldn't have pretended to do so. You can imagine just how ballistic my father went when he heard the idea that he might be lying to this man. No portrait of my father would really be complete without speaking to his religious side. His understanding of the character of God grew slowly as he aged. You would never have mistaken him for a conventionally religious man. Yet he once told me about how every so often he would kneel down in his shop and thank God for all he had been given. God brought many people into his life who were people of faith. His empiricism often collided with the claims of faith. He had a very simple conception of God's dealings with mankind. Yet at the end of his life, I heard him speak of the Lord in a way that I had never heard him use before. It seemed that something of the distinction between the creator and the creature was being driven home. And my dad was becoming aware of who was who. By now, I hope it is apparent that my father was a man of unusual intensity. You might have noticed the words that attached to his character: loved, competition, driven, contempt, passion, truth, debunking, relentlessly, precision, relish, willing, opinion, all flowed from him as from an artesian well. His nature never rested. Perhaps Theodore Roosevelt's description of the strenuous life is close. If he thought it was important, why, the remainder of the world had better get on board. He was always generous, both with time and with treasure, but hated someone presuming on his generosity. I didn't know him as fully until I came to work with him. He could drive me nuts at times, yet we always had great fun together. I am in his debt for instilling in me a willingness to take on challenging things and to hammer at a design problem until the solution is found. And it ought to be the best solution, not just the first solution. Critique your own work. I am thankful and proud to have known him, sharing in his guitar-making career, and even more, having him as my father. In the last year of his life, we were driving back to our house on the Honda Road, and we had to play a game which he devised, in which you had to guess how many cars would pass us in the other direction, from the bottom of the hill, Bertola Road, to Grandview Drive. We even had to make adjustments for bicycles, and whoever was closest got bragging rights. Dad was game right to the end. Thank you.